Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked at the strange purple plants growing around him. The air on this planet felt thick and warm, like breathing through a wet towel. He had been walking for 2 hours now, collecting soil, samples and taking pictures of the weird vegetation that covered this world. His team called it Kepler-4 for 2b, but the locals had their own name for it that sounded like wind chimes when they spoke. 3 days ago, the human ship UES Pathfinder had made contact with the beings who lived here. They called themselves Zephyrians, and they looked like tall, blue-skinned people with arms that seemed too long for their bodies. Their eyes were huge and glowed softly in the dim light of their orange sun. Commander Lisa Brooks had done all the talking while Jake and the other specialists waited on the ship. Now Jake was finally on the surface, doing what he loved most, studying rocks and dirt and plants. He was a simple geologist from Colorado who had joined the space program because he wanted to see what kind of minerals might exist on other worlds. He never expected to find a planet full of intelligent life, but here he was, trying not to step on anything that might be important to the locals. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment Jake was kneeling beside a stream, filling a sample container with the clear blue water, and the next moment the sky turned dark green and wind started howling around him. The Zephyrians had warned them about sudden weather changes, but Jake had gotten too focused on his work to pay attention to the sky. Rain began falling in sheets, but it was not like earth rain. This water was warm and felt oily against his skin. Jake looked around frantically for shelter. His communication device crackled with static, and he could barely hear Commander Brooks trying to call all team members back to the landing site. The storm was too strong for him to make it back safely. Through the driving rain, Jake saw what looked like a building made of crystal. It was tall and narrow, with walls that seemed to glow from within. He ran toward it, slipping on the wet ground and nearly falling twice. When he reached the structure, he found an opening that was just tall enough for him to walk through if he ducked his head. Inside, the building was warm and dry. The walls were covered in smooth crystal that gave off a soft blue light, bright enough for Jake to see clearly. The floor was made of the same material, polished so smooth it looked like ice. In the center of the room stood a single pillar of crystal that reached from floor to ceiling. It was beautiful, but Jake felt like he was trespassing in someone's home. He walked carefully around the pillar, looking at the strange symbols carved into its surface. They seemed to move in the crystal light, shifting and changing as he watched. Jake pulled out his camera to take pictures, thinking Dr. Amy Carter would want to see these markings. She was the team expert on alien languages and had been working hard to understand how the Zephyrians communicated. The storm outside grew louder, and Jake decided to wait until it passed before trying to return to his team. He sat down on the smooth floor and opened his sample kit, organizing the specimens he had collected. The crystal pillar hummed softly, a sound that was almost musical. It reminded him of his grandmother's wind chimes back home in Denver. Jake was labeling his final sample container when he heard footsteps outside. Someone was coming through the rain. He stood up quickly, wondering if he should hide or try to explain his presence. Before he could decide, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a Zephyrian woman, tall and graceful like all her people, with skin the color of a summer sky. Her long hair was wet from the rain and clung to her shoulders. She wore a simple white robe that seemed to shine in the crystal light. When she saw Jake standing beside the pillar, her large eyes went wide with surprise. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Jake raised his hand in what he hoped was a friendly gesture and tried to remember the Zephyrian words for hello and sorry. But before he could speak, something extraordinary happened. The woman dropped to her knees. She pressed her forehead to the smooth crystal floor and began speaking rapidly in her musical language. Jake could not understand a word, but her tone sounded like a prayer or a song of praise. Other voices joined hers from outside the building. More Zephyrians were coming through the storm. Jake stood frozen, completely confused. He looked down at the kneeling woman, then at the crystal pillar, then back at the woman. Had he done something wrong? Was this some kind of punishment? He tried to gesture for her to stand up, but she only spoke faster. Her voice filled with what sounded like joy and wonder. Within minutes, the crystal building was full of all on their knees, all speaking in that same reverent tone. Jake found himself surrounded by dozens of blue-skinned beings who seemed to be worshipping him. He had no idea what was happening or what he was supposed to do about it. The storm outside began to quiet, but the storm of confusion in Jake's mind was just beginning. Dr. Amy Carter arrived at the crystal building just as the rain stopped falling. She had been searching for Jake for over an hour, following his tracks through the muddy ground while calling his name over the communication device, when she heard the voices coming from inside the strange structure. She knew she had found him, but she also knew something was very wrong. Amy pushed through the crowd of Zephyrians gathered outside the building. They were all talking excitedly in their native language, pointing at the crystal structure and making gestures toward the sky. She had spent months learning their language before the mission, but they were speaking too fast for her to follow every word. She caught phrases like the one who was promised in time of fulfillment, but could not piece together the full meaning. Inside the building, Amy found Jake standing next to the central crystal pillar, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Around him, dozens of Zephyrians knelt on the floor, their voices raised in what sounded like songs of worship. Jake saw her enter and his face showed pure relief. "Amy, thank God you're here," Jake said quietly. "I don't know what's happening. I was just waiting out the storm and this woman came in and fell to her knees. Now they're all doing it and I can't make them stop." Amy listened carefully to the Zephyrian chanting, picking out words and phrases she recognized. Her face grew pale as she began to understand what they were saying. She grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him aside, speaking in a whisper. "Jake, I think you've accidentally fulfilled some kind of prophecy. They're calling you the Pale Wanderer who would come from the stars. This building, it's not just any structure. It's one of their most sacred temples." Jake looked around at the crystal walls with new understanding. "I had no idea. I was just getting out of the rain. How was I supposed to know this was a religious site?" "The problem is bigger than that," Amy said, still listening to the chanting. "They're saying something about the time of withering and the one who would bring wisdom to heal the world. Jake, I think they believe you're some kind of savior." Before Jake could respond, the crowd outside grew louder. More Zephyrians were arriving, drawn by news that spread faster than wildfire through their communities. Amy could see hundreds of blue figures gathering in the distance, all moving toward the temple. Some carried what looked like offerings, flowers, crystals, and intricately carved objects. Commander Lisa Brooks' voice crackled through their communication devices. "Carter, Morrison, report your status immediately. We're getting reports of large gatherings of locals moving in your direction." Amy activated her device. "Commander, we have a situation here. Jake inadvertently entered a sacred site during the storm, and the locals believe he's fulfilling some kind of religious prophecy. We need immediate cultural support and possibly a diplomatic team." "Understood. Stay put and try not to make the situation worse. We're sending a full team." But the situation was already getting worse by the minute. The Zephyrian woman who had first found Jake stood up and approached him with reverent steps. She was young, maybe the equivalent of 25 in human years, with intricate tattoos covering her arms and face. She spoke directly to Jake in careful, formal Zephyrian. Amy translated quickly. "Her name is Valendra. She says she's been chosen to serve as your guide and interpreter. She's asking for your blessing on her people's crops because they're failing due to the drought." Jake looked helplessly at Amy. "What am I supposed to say to that? I'm a geologist, not a farmer, and I'm definitely not anyone's savior." "You need to be very careful with your words," Amy warned. "Everything you say now could be interpreted as divine wisdom." Even your confusion might be seen as a test of their faith. Jake tried to think of something simple and harmless to say. He gestured toward the withered plants visible through the temple entrance and spoke slowly in basic Zephyrian. Plants need water. Water comes from sky and ground. The crowd fell silent. Then Valandra translated his words to the others, and they erupted in excited chatter. Amy groaned as she heard them discussing Jake's profound wisdom about the connection between earth and sky. Jake, you just gave them agricultural advice, and they're treating it like divine revelation, Amy whispered. More Zephyrians kept arriving. Soon the area around the temple was packed with hundreds of beings, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the human they believed was their prophesied savior. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to see better. Elderly Zephyrians leaned on walking sticks, their eyes bright with hope. Captain Ben Hayes arrived with a full diplomatic team just as the sun was setting. The orange light made the crystal temple glow like fire, and the assembled crowd looked even more impressive in the twilight. Hayes took one look at the situation and immediately called for a meeting with his senior staff. This is exactly the kind of cultural interference we were supposed to avoid, Hayes said grimly. One misunderstanding could destabilize their entire society. Dr. Tony Wright, the mission anthropologist, had been studying the crowd through binoculars. Captain, look at their faces. These people aren't just curious about Jake. They're desperate. Whatever prophecy he's supposedly fulfilling, it's connected to something they desperately need. Amy had been talking quietly with Valandra, learning more about the Zephyrian beliefs. She returned to the group with disturbing news. The prophecy speaks of a pale wanderer who would arrive during their world's time of withering. Their crops have been failing for 3 years, due to drought. They believe Jake was sent to save them from starvation. Jake sat down heavily on a supply crate. So if I can't actually save them, what happens then? Do they lose faith in everything? Do they blame us for giving them false hope? Or, Hayes said quietly, do they decide we're enemies who came here to trick them? The crowd outside continued to grow as night fell. Bonfires were lit, and the Zephyrians began to sing traditional songs. Their voices carried across the landscape, calling others to come and witness the fulfillment of prophecy. Jake could see the lights of distant settlements beginning to move as entire communities prepared to make the journey to the temple. Commander Brooks established a secure perimeter around the temple, but she made it clear to her team that they were there to protect, not to threaten. The last thing they needed was for the Zephyrians to see the human visitors as an occupying force. As Jake prepared to spend the night in the temple that had become the center of a religious awakening, he realized that his simple desire to study rocks and soil had somehow made him responsible for the hopes and dreams of an entire alien civilization. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any rock he had ever lifted. Jake woke up on the crystal floor of the temple with his back aching and his mind full of worry. Through the night, he had listened to the Zephyrians singing outside, their voices rising and falling like waves on an ocean. Now, as the orange sun rose over the horizon, he could see that even more people had arrived during the darkness. The crowd stretched as far as his eyes could reach. Valandra had stayed in the temple all night, sitting quietly near the entrance, like a guard. When Jake stirred, she immediately approached him with a bowl of something that looked like soup. She spoke in careful Zephyrian, and Amy, who had also spent the night in the temple, translated. She's brought you morning food. She says it's made from the sacred grains that grow only near temples. She's giving you the most precious food her people have. Jake looked at the thin soup and felt his stomach turn. Not because it looked bad, but because he knew that accepting it would make the situation worse. Every kind gesture from the Zephyrians seemed to deepen their belief that he was special, but he was also hungry, and refusing their gift might offend them. He took the bowl and tasted it carefully. The soup was sweet and warm, with a flavor like honey mixed with vegetables. He smiled at Valandra and said thank you in her language. Her face lit up with joy, and she immediately turned to tell the others outside about his reaction to their sacred food. Dr. Tony Wright had arrived early that morning to study the crowd. He pulled Jake aside with concerning news. "Jake, we have a serious problem developing. The traditional Zephyrian leadership is not happy about what's happening here. Their religious priests feel threatened by all this attention you're getting. Some of their political leaders think this whole thing is disrupting their society." Amy added more bad news. "I've been listening to conversations in the crowd. People are starting to argue about what your presence means. Some believe you're here to save them, but others think you're a test of their faith. A few are saying that if you're really divine, you should be able to end their drought immediately." Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "What happens if I tell them the truth? That I'm just a regular person who got caught in the rain?" "That's the problem," Tony said. "I've studied their culture extensively. The Zephyrians have built their entire belief system around this prophecy. If we destroy their faith now, when they're already struggling with crop failures and social problems, it could cause their civilization to collapse." Commander Brooks joined their discussion with more troubling information. "I've been in contact with Earth's diplomatic corps. They're sending experts, but it will take months for them to arrive. Meanwhile, we have reports of Zephyrian settlements emptying as entire populations come here to see Jake. Their normal work is stopping. Fields are being abandoned." Jake looked out at the sea of blue faces watching the temple. Children played between the adults, but he could see that many of the older Zephyrians looked thin and tired. These were people who had been struggling to survive, and they had pinned all their hopes on him. "What if I try to help them with their real problems?" Jake asked. "Not as some kind of god, but just as someone with different knowledge. Maybe I can teach them things about farming or finding water." Tony shook his head. "Every time you help them, it will confirm their belief that you're divine. You're trapped in a cycle where being helpful makes the problem worse." But Jake was already thinking about the drought that was killing their crops. As a geologist, he understood water systems and soil composition. He had noticed things about their planet that the Zephyrians might not have considered. Their soil was rich, but poorly drained. Their irrigation systems were ancient and inefficient. There were underground water sources they probably did not know about. Valandra approached again, this time with several other Zephyrians, who looked like important people. They wore elaborate robes and carried staffs decorated with crystals. Amy listened to their conversation and looked worried. "These are regional leaders from different settlements. They're asking you to perform the great healing mentioned in their prophecy. They want you to end the drought that's been destroying their world for 3 years. Jake felt his heart sink. And what exactly does this great healing involve? According to their beliefs, the Pale Wanderer will call upon the powers of sky and earth to bring life-giving water back to their world. They expect you to make it rain." The leaders waited expectantly, while Jake tried to think of what to say. He looked at their hopeful faces, at the crowd of thousands watching from outside, at the withered plants visible in the distance. These people were dying slowly, and they believed he could save them. "I need time to understand your world better," Jake said carefully in Zephyrian. "The healing of sky and earth requires knowledge of both." The leaders nodded solemnly, and began discussing his words among themselves. Amy translated their response. "They're impressed by your wisdom in wanting to study their world before acting. They're giving you 3 days to prepare for the great healing ceremony." After the leaders left, Jake sat down heavily beside the crystal pillar. 3 days to figure out how to make it rain, or these people will lose faith in everything they believe in. Captain Hayes had been listening from the entrance. "Jake, we do have atmospheric processors on the Pathfinder. They're designed for terraforming, but they could theoretically be modified to seed clouds and increase rainfall. But using them would violate every first contact protocol we have," Commander Brooks pointed out. "We're not supposed to interfere with natural planetary systems." "And it would make Jake look like he really is divine," Amy added. If he calls down rain from the sky using our technology, we'll never be able to convince the Zephyrians that he's just human. Jake looked out at the crowd again. More people were arriving every hour. Some looked sick and weak from hunger. Children clung to their parents, their large eyes reflecting the same hope he saw in all the adult faces. These were not just believers in a prophecy. They were desperate people who needed help to survive. What's more important? Jake asked quietly. Following our protocols or saving lives? Nobody had an easy answer to that question. As the second day began, Jake found himself caught between his human desire to help suffering people and the knowledge that every action he took would deepen a lie that could eventually destroy the very people he wanted to save. Jake spent the second day walking through the Zephyrian settlements with Valandra as his guide. What he saw broke his heart. The drought had lasted 3 years, and its effects were everywhere. Wells that once provided fresh water now contained only mud. Fields that should have been green with crops were brown and cracked. Storage buildings that once held grain for the winter months stood empty. But Jake also saw something that gave him hope. The Zephyrians were intelligent and resourceful people. They had built complex irrigation systems in the past, though many were now broken or abandoned. They understood agriculture and had developed sophisticated tools for farming. Their problem was not lack of knowledge, but lack of water and poor soil management. Valandra, Jake said as they stood beside a dried-up canal, your people built this water system. How long ago? She looked proud as she answered. My great-grandfather helped build these channels. They brought water from the mountains to our fields for many generations. Jake studied the ancient stonework. The engineering was impressive, but the design had flaws that became obvious once he understood the local geography. The canals were too shallow and followed inefficient routes. Much of the water was lost to evaporation and seepage before it reached the crops. What if we could make these work better? Jake asked. Not with magic, but by changing how they're built. That evening, Jake called a meeting with his human team. Captain Hayes, Commander Brooks, Dr. Carter, Dr. Wright, and Chief Engineer Kate Miller gathered in the temple, while thousands of Zephyrians waited outside for news of the promised great healing. I have an idea, Jake began, but it's risky and it requires all of us to work together. Instead of positioning myself as someone who can magically end the drought, what if we teach the Zephyrians to solve the problem themselves? Kate Miller leaned forward with interest. What do you have in mind? Their irrigation system is fixable. Their soil problems can be addressed with better farming techniques. There are underground water sources they haven't tapped. We can help them with engineering and technology, but we frame it as collaboration, not divine intervention. Commander Brooks looked skeptical. Jake, they expect you to call down rain from the sky. How do you explain teaching them about irrigation instead? By making it about their strength, not my power, Jake replied. What if the prophecy isn't about someone who will save them, but about someone who will show them how to save themselves? Dr. Wright nodded slowly. It could work. Many religious prophecies are actually about empowerment rather than dependence. We'd be reinterpreting their beliefs rather than destroying them. The next morning, Jake stood before the assembled crowd with Valandra, translating his words. His heart pounded as he looked out at thousands of hopeful faces, knowing that what he said next would determine the fate of their relationship. People of this world, Jake began, the healing you seek is not magic from the sky. It is wisdom that already exists in your hands and minds. The prophecy speaks of learning, not miracles. A murmur went through the crowd. Some looked confused, others disappointed. But Jake continued before doubt could take hold. Your ancestors built great channels to bring water to your fields. You have the knowledge to build them again, better than before. The earth holds water beneath your feet, waiting for you to find it. The sky will give you rain when you prepare the ground to receive it. Jake gestured to Kate Miller, who had brought several pieces of human equipment. We will work together, your people and mine, to heal this land. But the healing will come from your effort, your wisdom, your hands." For a moment, the crowd was silent. Then an elderly Zephyrian stepped forward. He was thin and bent with age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He spoke in a voice that carried across the entire gathering. Amy translated his words. "He says he remembers the old ways of finding underground water. His grandfather taught him, but the knowledge was almost lost. He wants to know if you will help him teach the young people." Jake felt a surge of relief. "Yes, we will learn from your wisdom and share what we know." What followed was the most intensive collaboration Jake had ever experienced. Human engineers worked alongside Zephyrian builders to repair and improve the ancient irrigation system. Kate Miller taught young Zephyrians about water pumps and filtration while learning their traditional methods of soil preparation. Dr. Carter helped establish a communication system so that different settlements could coordinate their efforts. Jake found himself becoming a teacher rather than a figure of worship. He showed the Zephyrians how to use simple tools to detect underground water sources. He explained concepts of soil chemistry and crop rotation. Most importantly, he learned as much from them as he taught. Valandra became his primary partner in this work. She was intelligent and eager to learn, but she also helped Jake understand Zephyrian culture and avoid mistakes that could cause offense. Together, they developed new farming techniques that combined human knowledge with traditions. But not everyone was happy with this approach. Some Zephyrians felt disappointed that Jake was not performing obvious miracles. A group of traditional priests complained that he was corrupting their sacred beliefs by mixing them with practical work. Some human crew members worried that they were sharing too much technology too quickly. The real test came when they attempted to reactivate a major irrigation canal that had been dry for 2 years. Jake and Kate had identified the engineering problems and worked with Zephyrian builders to make the necessary repairs. But would their collaborative solution actually work? Hundreds of Zephyrians gathered to watch as the improved canal system was tested. Jake stood with Valandra and the elderly waterfinder as they opened the channels that would direct mountain runoff toward the dried fields. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, water began to flow. It started as a trickle, then grew to a stream, then became a rushing current that filled the stone channels and spread out into the prepared fields. The crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard for miles. Children ran alongside the flowing water, laughing and splashing. Adults wept with relief and joy. But Jake noticed something more important than the celebration. The Zephyrians were not looking at him with worship anymore. They were looking at each other with pride and accomplishment. They had done this work with their own hands, using their own knowledge combined with new ideas. As the sun set on that day, Jake realized that they had achieved something more valuable than ending a drought. They had built a foundation for genuine friendship between two species, based on mutual respect rather than false divinity. 3 months later, Jake stood in the same crystal temple where his strange journey had begun, but everything had changed. Through the entrance, he could see green fields stretching to the horizon, filled with healthy crops that swayed in the gentle breeze. The sound of flowing water came from the improved irrigation channels that now carried mountain streams to every corner of the valley. Valandra entered the temple, carrying a small crystal pendant that caught the light from the walls. She had become more than just a translator during their work together. She had learned to speak basic English while teaching Jake to speak Zephyrian fluently. More importantly, she had become his friend and partner in bridging the gap between their two species. "The harvest festival begins tomorrow," she said, switching easily between her language and his. "The elders want you to speak at the ceremony, but not as the pale wanderer from prophecy. They want you to speak as Jake Morrison, friend of the Zephyrian people." Jake smiled at how natural that sounded now. The transformation had not happened overnight. There had been difficult moments when some Zephyrians felt disappointed that he was not the divine savior they had expected. Some had left the settlements, unable to adapt to the new understanding. But most had found something better than a god to worship. They had found confidence in their own abilities. "What will I say to them?" Jake asked. "Tell them what you told me yesterday," Valandra replied, "that the real miracle was not ending the drought, but discovering what we could accomplish when we worked together." Captain Hayes and Commander Brooks entered the temple with news from the Pathfinder. "Jake, we've received permission from Earth Command to establish a permanent research station here. The Zephyrian Council has officially invited us to stay and continue our collaborative projects." Dr. Carter joined them with her latest translation work. "I've been studying more of their historical records. The prophecy about the Pale Wanderer was not really about someone coming to save them. It was about a time when they would meet travelers from other worlds and learn that they were not alone in the universe. The ancient Zephyrians were preparing their descendants for first contact." Jake laughed at the irony. "So the prophecy was actually about making friends with aliens, and I thought it was about me being some kind of god." The confusion was understandable, Dr. Wright added. "Prophecies are often misinterpreted over time. What matters is that both species learned something valuable from the misunderstanding." That evening, Jake walked through the settlements with Valandra, visiting the projects they had worked on together. The irrigation system now supplied water to fields that had been barren for years. New wells provided fresh drinking water to communities that had been rationing every drop. Most importantly, young Zephyrians and humans worked side by side, learning from each other and developing innovations that neither species could have created alone. They stopped at a workshop where Kate Miller was teaching Zephyrian engineers how to build more efficient water pumps while learning their techniques for crafting tools from local materials. The exchange of knowledge flowed both ways, with each species contributing their strengths to solve common problems. "My people have a saying," Valandra told Jake as they watched the collaboration. "The strongest crystals are formed when different minerals grow together. I think the same is true for civilizations." The next day, the harvest festival filled the valley with music, dancing, and celebration. Tables were loaded with food grown in the restored fields. Children from both species played together, switching between languages as easily as they switched between games. The elderly Zephyrian, who had remembered the old water-finding techniques, sat with Captain Hayes, sharing stories about their respective home worlds. When the time came for speeches, Jake stood before the mixed crowd of humans, and as ever, he no longer felt the weight of false expectations or the fear of disappointing people who saw him as divine. He was simply a human being among friends. "When I first came to your world," Jake began, "I was lost in a storm and looking for shelter. I found much more than that. I found a people who were willing to share their knowledge, their culture, and their friendship with strangers from the stars." He paused to let Valandra translate, though many Zephyrians now understood English well enough to follow his words. "The prophecy your ancestors left you was not about waiting for someone else to solve your problems. It was about having the courage to work with others, to learn from them, and to teach them in return. The real miracle is not that your fields are green again. The real miracle is that two species from different worlds can become friends." The crowd applauded, but Jake held up his hand to continue. "In 6 months, the Pathfinder will leave to continue exploring the galaxy. But we will not be saying goodbye. We will be saying until we meet again. Some of your people will come with us to see other worlds. Some of my people will stay here to continue our shared work. This is not the end of our story together. It is just the beginning." After the speeches, as the celebration continued into the night, Valandra presented Jake with the crystal pendant she had been carrying. It was carved in the shape of a water drop, symbolic of the drought they had ended together. "This is not a religious artifact," she explained. "It is a token of friendship between equals. When you travel to other worlds, Carry it as a reminder that the Zephyrians will always welcome you home." Jake accepted the pendant with genuine emotion. "What will happen here after we leave?" "We will continue growing," Valandra replied. "The techniques you taught us, the knowledge we shared with you, these things will spread to all our settlements. But more than that, we have learned that we are not alone in the universe. That knowledge changes everything." 6 months later, as the Pathfinder prepared to leave the Zephyrian system, Jake stood on the ship's observation deck, watching the blue-green world grow smaller. Valandra and 12 other young Zephyrians were aboard, having volunteered to join the human exploration mission. Meanwhile, Kate Miller and 6 other humans had chosen to remain on the planet to help establish the new joint research facility. The crystal pendant hung around Jake's neck, catching the light from distant stars. He thought about how a simple misunderstanding had led to one of the most successful first contact experiences in human history. The Zephyrians had not found a god in that crystal temple. They had found something much more valuable, proof that friendship and cooperation could overcome any challenge. As the ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying its mixed crew toward new adventures among the stars, Jake realized that this was what humanity did best. Not conquering other worlds or proving their superiority, but making friends, sharing knowledge, and working together to build something better than either species could achieve alone. The alien woman, who had dropped to her knees in that temple, had taught him that the greatest miracles come not from divine power, but from the simple human act of reaching out to help a neighbor, regardless of what world they call home.